Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Working Smarter series. My name is Johannes Molin, and I'm a product manager at Viedoc Technologies. Today, I'm going to introduce our new tool called Viedoc SDV Manager, and we hope that you'll be as excited as we are about our new solution. Okay, before we take a look at the product, it is worth understanding a key concept in our solution and why we solved this problem the way we did. Today's presentation will cover a short background, common industry practices before discussing Viedoc's solution, and then I'll move to the live demo and eventually get back to a short summary. My plan is to spend about half my time in the presentation and the other half in the Viedoc UI during the demo. So a very brief background. Today, there is consensus in the industry that SDV brings limited value. I don't think we need to argue about that. I think people would also agree that studies using 100% source data verification has decreased in the past years. Authorities have been on board with risk-based approaches, reduced SDV for well over a decade. And now you can also see that there is an increased push in the latest revision of GCP. Someone actually told me a couple of days ago, the word proportion, as in risk proportionality, is used 2 times in GCP revision 2, but 20 times in revision 3. And that tells you something about the increased push for risk-based approaches. So you would imagine that with this knowledge, SDV would be significantly reduced in almost all studies and in all regions, but that is far from the case. Sponsor still admits to doing excessive SDV, and industry survey still shows that the adoption to reduce SDV is slow. So why are sponsors not reducing SDV more than they are today? This is why we should bother, and this is the problem that we wanted to solve. How can we give our customers the control to reduce SDV as much as they want? So in conversations I've often held with customers, they admit that they do more SDV than they think is really needed because they say they are not comfortable or it feels too risky to reduce SDV more. And one direct quote was, if quality drops at the site, we don't know if we can still trust the data. So how can we make sponsors dare to reduce SDV or to be comfortable to reduce SDV to a higher extent than today? If they feel it's too risky to reduce SDV, what are the risks they want to be able to handle? I mean, how can we make sure we can trust the data without adding excessive SDV again? So if we take that last quote from a sponsor, if quality drops at a site, we don't know if we can still trust the data. And we ask, when is quality at the site commonly dropping? Because this is really what we want to be able to handle. And as you know, there are many different symptoms or indications of low quality at the site during a study. A lot of data errors, a lot of validation checks triggered, many manual queries raised, queries stay open for a long time, data entry lag, perhaps a lot of protocol deviations, etc. But it gets more interesting when we interview customers to understand common root causes to why the sites are struggling, why we see these symptoms of low site performance. And they typically mention that this is based on like the site is being understaffed, or there are new or unqualified staff, poor training, perhaps temporary logistical challenges at a site, or protocol updates not being communicated well enough or not understood by the site. So these are common root causes to why a site would struggle at a certain period of time. But there is one important conclusion here, and that is that risk is not at all related to specific patients, but risk is associated with a time period. At different periods in time, some sites may struggle. Keep this in mind for the next part of the presentation. Now, I'll move to look at a few common approaches in the industry, common approaches to source data verification. And we can also talk about how those approaches respond to these time periods where we see an increased risk. So in the coming slides, I will visualize my examples with an example timeline of subject visits at a specific site. So you will see subjects are continuously recruited. So at the time one subject is perhaps performing a visit 10, another subject is performing visit 1, and so on. Here I've marked in red what is SDV'd with a high level plan, and with green what is SDV'd with a low level plan. And to keep it simple, in my example, we can just imagine that red equals 100% SDV, and we can say that green equals 50% SDV, the 50% most important items in the green cells. So visualized here is common model, probably the most common model of them all. In this example, you see that the first two subjects are being SDV'd with a high level plan. And then you can see that every fifth subject is being SDV'd with that high level plan. Of course, that varies. It could be every third patient, every seventh, and so on. But something like this is a very common approach. Some customers would also create this plan up front and then stick to this plan no matter what kind of risk indicators they see at their sites. So they would not even try to address an observed risk or increased risk. So if we're happy with only reducing the level of SDV, this could be enough. At least we're not doing 100% SDV for all the subjects, right? But if I move on to my next image, you will see why this is not really responding to risk at all. So in this image, I've also added risk indicators. A red arrow means that the risk is high. A green arrow means that the risk is low. Whatever mode you use to detect site risk does not really matter here. It can be with the use of an external RBQM software that has very sophisticated tools and analyze data in all possible directions to see if the site is high risk or low risk. But it could also be much more simple methods like just reviewing the on-site monitoring visit report, or it can be based on a monthly review meeting that is held between clinical operations and data management, or a quarterly review meeting when you look at data from Viedoc exports and Viedoc reports or whatever. The mode you use to flag if the site is performing well or not does not really matter for the approach we will discuss. So in this example, the site would start as a high-risk site. Perhaps the site was not known to the sponsor from before, so they didn't know if the site would perform well. But early on, we see a green arrow, meaning that there is an indication that the site is performing well. And then we have another green arrow, and then later on in the study, there is an indication of low quality. That's the second red arrow that you can see in the middle here. And this time period highlighted here is a period with increased risk. The risk indicators are suggesting this is high risk at this time. So this is where we have the data that the sponsor said they might no longer feel confident with. And this is the area we would want to focus on. And as you can see, our efforts are not focusing on this high risk period at all. A lot of time is still being spent on SDVing in different time periods when all our indicators are telling us the quality at the site is high, but time is not, or effort is not being spent on verifying the data, even in the time periods when our own indicators are telling us the quality has dropped. And again, where the customer is saying that they are concerned they cannot trust the data. So in my opinion, this is just a poor way of responding to observed risk. This is just a way to reduce SDV to cut costs, but we don't really know if we can trust the data in this risk period. So is there any approaches taken here to try to respond to the increased risk? Yeah, one way is to try to upgrade all patients in a specific block, like in this example here. But we can see that this is also not aligning very well with the risk period, the way we defined it. Another option that we have heard from customers being used is that you say that you will upgrade the next couple of patients enrolled, which may completely miss the target here if you want to put your effort on where you see the increased risk. So this is another great example of completely missing the high risk period. So if we put a timeline on the observed site risk, as indicated here in the bottom of the image, we see that the risk is high in the beginning. Remember, when we don't really know the site. And then at a period in the middle, the risk is high again, when our risk indicators are flagging this site as a high risk site. If we then compare this to where our verification effort goes, as indicated on the top of the page, we see that it does not correspond well to the risk at all. So with this in mind, I can understand sponsors who claim they don't want their SDV rates, even for the low level SDV, to drop too low, because when there are issues at a site, they can't respond very well to that risk. So let's take a look at how we are going to address this problem in Viedoc. I'll be using similar illustrations here and a similar scenario, but obviously I'll be using a different SDV strategy. So this is, again, a site we did not know from before. So we can assume this specific site starts with a high level SDV plan. So as soon as we determine that quality is good, we can reduce the SDV rate right away based on date. We do not need to spend extra effort on this site right now. Not for any patient. We cut across the entire group of patients based on date and reduce SDV levels right away. But then we get to the same point in time as in the other scenario. Our risk indicators are flagging that this site is high risk now. Something happened and the quality dropped. So how can we now respond to this increased risk? Well, instead of performing more SDV on specific patients, we will now do two things to respond to this increased risk level. First of all, we'll change the plan and assign a high-level SDV plan going forward. And we will also upgrade the SDV requirement by adding the high-level SDV plan from the date of the last indication of low risk, or for any date that you select yourself. So this will give you the chance to upgrade SDV for a problem period, so that you know that you can take action on when there is an indication on increased risk. So together, this will give you a great response to what was flagged as a risk at the site, and the sponsor can rest assured that, well, the data in this time period was verified appropriately. So it will give you the capability to act on increased risk, like a risk-based approach to SDV. And since you have that capability to respond to risk, you can now also be more confident with reducing SDV levels for the low-level plan, much more than you otherwise would have. Because if something happens and the risk is increasing, you can simply upgrade the SDV anyway. And once we get indications the quality is acceptable again, we can reduce the level of SDV. But we know now that we can trust the data reported for this high risk period. If we make a similar exercise as for the previous approach, we see the same timeline with observed site risk at the bottom of the image, but we now see that the verification efforts, as indicated in the top of the page, match the observed site risk level in a very nice way. So if we present these two approaches together, what we can see is that a traditional by patient approach, even though reducing SDV, is not spending effort on where most risk has been indicated. It's a poor response to increased risk. In contrast, the time period approach, you can map the effort spent precisely to where you observe the risk at a site. And as I mentioned, the flip side of this, with the capacity to respond strongly to an increased risk, you have the control and the confidence to reduce your low-level SDV even further. Okay, let's take a look at how this actually looks in the system. So I'll move over to Viedoc. And I'll be using a development instance today where we are already operating on Viedoc 495. So this is the release that will come out to production instances next week. So here you can see a new icon, Viedoc SDV Manager. So we'll open that and it will open in a new tab and it will guide me directly to the site assignments page. Here you will see the sites in my study, and you will see which SDV plans that are currently assigned. You can see right away that I'm using 3 plans here. In my examples in the presentation, I used 2 plans only. That was just to keep the examples clean and simple. But in Viedoc SDV Manager, you can actually use any number of plans that you would want to. We would strongly recommend you to keep the number of plans down to like 2 or 3 to reduce operational complexity. There is a risk with adding too many plans that it will just complicate the situation. So here you can see which plans are currently assigned. You can see when the assignment was made. And here you can see what I was mentioning in my presentation. Here you can see the plan timeline, meaning for these different sites, which SDV plans have been in use. And you immediately get an overview of what plans they have been on for all the sites in the study. You can also open a specific timeline. If you have a long running study and you have many plan assignments, you can sort of zoom in on the specific site to see exactly which plans have been in use. And if you are a CRO, I would also recommend you to give the sponsor the permissions needed to view this on their own so that they can see, how are we treating perhaps the problematic site in Stockholm? They are operating under the high-level SDV plan, so that you can be very transparent with the sponsor and they can easily see for themselves how different sites are being treated. But let's back up a little bit. Now I just jumped straight into the new application, but I'll take a few steps back and answer, the question, how did we get here? So I will start in Viedoc Designer, and I will show you what has been done in Viedoc Designer. So first of all, with Viedoc 495, the SDV settings in Viedoc Designer will no longer be functional for new added studies. All existing studies will continue to operate just the way they are today. But if you add your study after the 495 release, you will see this for the SDV settings, meaning that SDV Manager is in use, meaning that you do all your SDV configuration in Viedoc SDV Manager instead of Designer. If you would open the settings here, you would see a warning just saying that the settings are managed in SDV Manager now. The next thing you'll need to be aware of is the roles where we have new permissions. So if I take an example here with the project manager role, you can see that we have a number of new permissions. So in true Viedoc style, you can be very granular with your permissions, and you can decide for yourselves which role would typically perform these tasks. As an example, who would normally create and edit SDV plans in your organization? Is it the project manager or is it data management? Well, you can decide for yourself by adding the permission to the roles as you see fit. So we have permissions for viewing plans, creating, publishing plans, view plan assignments, which was the view I just started with, where you can see the plan timelines, and then also the capability to assign plans to sites. And before we move out from Viedoc Designer, I want to show you one more thing. It's minor, but it has importance later on in the presentation. So in the subject status section, you could previously add a definition for screened, enrolled, completed, and withdrawn. From Viedoc 495, you can also add a dedicated definition for the screening failure status. So this is new, and that will be important for the SDV Manager. So that's all in Viedoc Designer, and I'll move to Viedoc Admin instead. And I'll go to the same study and just quickly jump to the settings here, where you are today used to seeing 2 options for the SDV behavior. We have the legacy option of form level SDV, and we have the option that we have been using for the last couple of years with item level SDV. Now for ongoing studies, there will be a new option called Viedoc SDV Manager. So that means that for ongoing studies, you can sort of ditch the SDV configuration in Designer and move to Viedoc SDV Manager instead. One word of warning though, this action cannot be reverted. So if you have an ongoing study and you're interested in changing to Viedoc SDV Manager, please test this properly on the training instance, because this cannot be reverted. For all the new studies, they will automatically be locked to Viedoc SDV Manager. So any design configuration or SDV configuration in Designer will only be for ongoing studies, and over time that will be phased out. So we have Viedoc SDV Manager enabled. We have the permissions in the roles. Then you will see the icon here on the landing page. So that's why I could open Viedoc SDV Manager, and here I will see my site assignments. But the first time you launch Viedoc SDV Manager, you will not have any plans at all. So the first thing you would do is to go to the plans page. And here you can add new plans. Here you can see that I have 3 published plans. I also have a draft plan. And as I mentioned, you can add as many plans as you want to. You can add new plans, but you can also import. So export plans and then import them again. Exporting plans will be in a JSON format, so they will not be super user-friendly. It's not meant for human eyes for you to sort of have an overview of what the SDV plans include, but it's a mode of sort of transferring these plans within the system. So you can export them from perhaps a study on the training instance and move it to the production instance by importing it, and so on. You can also duplicate plans. So if you have created your first plan and you know that the next plan will be similar, then you can duplicate that plan and just make the necessary modifications. You can also decide, well, the name for the plan, the color for the plan, and so on. But let's take a look at one of the plans to see what they look like. So I'll open the high-level SDV plan, and you will see when it was published or modified. You will see that I have 2 different rules for this plan. So the first rule I've named screening failures. And if I open that quickly, you will see that it has a filter type of subject status, including screening failure. So if we're using the high-level SDV plan, the system will validate, is this a screening failure? Yes, then rule number 1 will apply. If it's not a screening failure, the system will then continue to validate the next rule, which in this case happens to be all subjects, but I've named it enrolled subjects. So it's important to add these rules in the right order or move them so they are in the right order, because you want to have the most specific rule first. Because if I would have these rules in the opposite order, then it would actually say first, well, the first rule will sort of always apply. Is the first rule a match? Yes, it is. Then it will never validate the second rule. You can also use other subject statuses like withdrawn if you for some reason would need to have different rules for withdrawn subjects. But I would assume that this would be the most common scenario, where you have a specific rule for screening failures first, and then you have a second rule for enrolled subjects. So within the rule, you have also a number of options. You are used to seeing in Viedoc Designer that you can specify within a specific design version, you can specify forms and items that should require SDV. The way it will work in Viedoc SDV Manager is that you set a number of targets, and for each target, you will decide if SDV is required or if it's optional. And if you leave forms and items out completely, it will still be not applicable. So the optional state is new and introduced in Viedoc 495. So you can decide which forms and items that should be included, just like you can in Designer today, but you can also specify on an events and activities level. And that means that you can have items in a form that require SDV on, let's say, the baseline visit and visit 10. But for all other visits, those items might not be required. We also have the possibility here to say that, well, if in this case we have the demographics form where the entire form is covered, so all the items within this form, but we can also use this setting here to say that all current and future items in this form, meaning that if you create a revision in your design and you add additional items into this form, they would automatically be included in your high-level SDV plan, in your screening failures rule, in target 1, just by default. Here you can also specify not only event, activities, forms, and items, but you can even go down to repeat keys. So if I make an example here with adverse events, you can say that we want to specify the first 1 or 2 instances by using the study event repeat key in this regard. The targets would work in the same way as the rules, meaning that they are evaluated from top to bottom. So if you would have a rule where you say that a specific item is required, and then you'll have another target saying that the same item is optional, well, the first would apply. So you would create the plans you need for your study, and you will save them and you will publish them. Now I'll just close this and discard my changes here. And when you have your plans defined, you will be back at the site assignments where you will assign these plans to the sites. So let's take an example here where we don't have a current plan. So here is also a way to highlight that, yeah, you probably need to take action here. Right now, there are no SDV requirements at all at this site. So let's say that I want to assign an SDV plan just as a starting point. And this site is just getting started. So I will assign a plan, and perhaps again this is a site that I don't know from before, and they will be starting tomorrow, so I'll just set the effective date like this, 3rd of June, and next, and then I'm asked to confirm, and then you'll see that this site is now operating on the high level plan. It works in the same way when you're making changes. Let's say that we now have indications that the site in Berlin is not performing well. We want to make a change and we want to assign a high-level SDV plan to this site. Again, I will go to assign plan and I want to assign the high-level plan again, and then you decide the date. So this is exactly what I was mentioning in my presentation, that you decide where do you define the risk period. Is it just from today and onwards, like you want to keep an extra eye on this site? Or is it that you want to say that, yeah, we don't really trust anything at this site, perhaps since the study coordinator left or something like that? Whatever date you select here, everything in Viedoc at this site with an event date on or after this date will be affected and will now be using the high-level SDV plan after this assignment. And again, you will see this very clearly in your overview as well. Now the high-level SDV plan is being used. You also have filters, like if you want to see specifically if you're using many sites and you want to single out the ones with a high-level SDV plan currently. You can also take batch action. This might not be as common because that would sort of assume that you want to assign the same plan and also with the same date. But let's say in the beginning of a study, you can take a batch action and assign perhaps a high-level plan or a low-level plan to multiple sites in one go. Yes, so let's take a look at how this would turn out in Viedoc Clinic then. So I will move back to the landing page and launch Viedoc Clinic. And, oh, sorry, I should have selected the monitors view. So the good thing is that in Viedoc Clinic, there are not many changes. There is one change that is going to be visible, and that's the new state of the optional SDV. So here you can see an example of where SDV is forced and when SDV is optional. And as you can see, the form level SDV checkbox will align with the required ones. So if you check the form level SDV checkbox, you will check the required ones. That is what you're expected to check. But with this configuration of allowing optional SDV, you can give the monitor extra flexibility, like saying that if you find any reason to review this further, you are allowed to do that. And speaking to different customers, some say that this is essential to give that extra freedom to monitors, while others say, well, we don't want them to review anything else than what we are telling them to review. The good thing here is that in your SDV plans, you have the flexibility to dictate what should be requiring SDV, what should be optional, and what should be not applicable at all. And with these different capabilities, these different SDV plans that you can use, these different rules in each SDV plan, there might be situations where you are getting lost here in clinic. Like, why is this requiring me to SDV this item for this subject? And that's when you can go to the exports. So if I'll just show you one update we have in the exports with the 495 release. And I have now made an export including review status. And as you know, you will get an SDV data set included in the export. What has been added in Viedoc 495 is 3 new columns. One called item SDV requirement, where you will see if an item is required or optional. Another one showing which SDV plan that is valid. So like, if you have a question on why is the date of birth requiring SDV for this patient, I wasn't expecting it to. And here you can see exactly why. It's because the low-level SDV plan applies and the rule for enrolled subjects. And that can help you sort of backtrack. Yeah, perhaps something was not configured the way you wanted to in that low-level plan. Perhaps you misunderstood if this was an enrolled subject or not. But here it can help you sort of to track and understand why SDV was required or not. Great. So let's go back to the presentation again. I want to wrap up with just some limitations for transparency and also a summary. So first, some limitations. Viedoc reports will continue to read SDV settings from the design until 496. So that means even when you have enabled Viedoc SDV Manager, you will have everything correct in clinic. You will have everything correct in the exports. But when you look at what is supposed to be SDV'd in Viedoc reports, it will show what is supposed to be SDV'd according to the design, which is not accurate or relevant. However, this is just temporary and will be included in 496, which is the next release after summer. So currently planned to the end of August or beginning of September. The next one is also related to Viedoc reports, and that's just to mention that the new screening failure definition that we have added in Designer is not yet implemented in Viedoc reports. So this will follow in a later release as well. Viedoc reports is currently using a derivation to calculate the screening failure status, which is the subject is not enrolled, but it's withdrawn. But that will change in the future as well. So the new screening failure definition that is set in Designer will work in clinic and will come out in the subject status export and will also be used in Viedoc SDV Manager. Then we have a limitation in SDV Manager that I want to flag. Assigning a new SDV plan to a site does not require a reason today, but this will be added in 496. So that means that you can document the reason, let's say why you are assigning the high-level SDV plan for the site in Berlin, as an example. So that will not be included in this release, but in the next one. And finally, enabling SDV Manager for ongoing studies. Keep in mind that this is a permanent action that cannot be reverted. So test this out properly on the training instance before you make this switch. If you make the switch, the SDV that you have performed in clinic will not go away. The SDV performed will be kept, but you will need to set the SDV requirements again in Viedoc SDV Manager. And then finally, quick summary. For studies that are added after the 495 release, all SDV settings are configured in Viedoc SDV Manager. Multiple SDV plans can be created, duplicated, imported, exported, updated, and they are completely decoupled from the CRF design. The SDV plans are very flexible and they can target items on an event, activity, form, and item level, including repeat keys. They can use different rules for different subject statuses, such as screening failure and enrolled. And they can set SDV to be required, optional, or not applicable. SDV plans can easily be assigned individually to sites to match changes to observed risk levels. So this is the core here, and this is what will make you able to work with SDV in a risk-based way. And like I showed you, SDV plans can be overviewed to quickly get an overview of historical and current SDV plan usage. And finally, exports are aligned with these new capabilities. It will track the plans and rules that have been used to make an item required, optional, or not applicable for SDV. Perfect. I think that was it. And that was all I was hoping to cover. And we have a couple of minutes left. So I will see if there are any questions in the chat. And there is a question of audit trails. So let's move back to the system again to cover those questions. There are audit logs available for both the assignment history, meaning who is assigning a plan to what site, what time, and so on. So we have assignment history, where you have the most important sort of values listed here, but you can also export it to get more information. And we also have audit logs for the plan history. Same thing here, you have the most important thing on the screen, but you can export this as a CSV as well. So yes, we have audit logs for this as well. And let's see what else we have. There is a question if we can update the plans, and the answer is yes. And it's a reference also to how it works today. And yeah, I understand this question because today it's a bit risky if you make a mistake in a new design version. Well, you know that you can't modify or correct SDV configurations in a revision. But here in Viedoc SDV Manager, the risk is much lower because at any point in time, let's say that you missed to make an item required. You can go into this plan for the specific rule, whatever is relevant, and you can make that change. Let's just add a form here. And you can see that I can now save this as a draft, and I'm able to publish the changes if I want to. So going back to this view, you see that I have pending changes. So far, there has been no impact on the sites that are currently using the high-level SDV plan. But if I publish those changes, these new requirements will apply to all sites at all time points where this high-level SDV plan is used. But again, it's pretty low risk, because if you make a mistake, you can just again update the plan and remove that form if you added it by mistake, and again publish the plan. So you can revert whatever you're doing. Same thing with site assignments. So I think I assigned the high-level plan here for the 25th of May, but let's say that was a mistake or that was for the wrong site or whatever. I can just sort of redo this, or I'll assign the low-level plan from the 25th again and confirm. And then you will see again, I'm back on the low-level plan. And of course, it's being tracked in the audit trail. So there is less risk today compared to what we had in the past with SDV configuration in the designs. And I see we are running out of time. I can take one final question. That's another question on the timeline. Yes. So the question is if we have a view to compare all timelines. Each timeline you see here is specific for the site. So in the case of the Washington site, I just added this with the start date of 3rd of June. So there might be different start dates for different sites. So keep that in mind that this is not always comparable all sites across, but you'll need to look at the timeline for each individual site. But still, it will give you a highly relevant comparison and overview of all the sites. I can see there are many more questions, but unfortunately, we do not have time to respond them all. But as mentioned in the beginning, we promise to get back to you with a recording and with all the questions answered. So with that, I would like to thank you for joining and for listening, and I would like to wish you a great rest of the day.